Welcome to the Monday Motivation Spotlight. Today, a more solemn day, being Yom Hazikaron, and in a couple of hours, Yom Haátzmaut. And today, as we all know, we commemorate not only soldiers that have fallen and given their lives for the state of Israel, but also victims of terror. And today takes on, this year in particular, takes on a lot more meaning. It's always been meaningful, but this year takes on a lot more meaning after October 7th, where most people agree that the day is very different and a lot more solemn than usual, including Yom Haátzmaut, which is meant to be a Chagigi day. So I'm Lesley Kaplan, your host for the series. Today we have a very special guest who I'll introduce in a moment. Your co-host ACI, thank you to them. And of course, as well, to our sponsors, Nashika Honey. So how do we work? Our speaker is going to share their story, or his story in this case, with you. Feel free, you're going to be staying muted. Feel free, if you're joining live, of course, feel free to comment or ask any questions via the chat, and to keep yourself muted though. And although this is not a networking group, and today, especially being Yom Hazikaron, I remind you that you are enabled to, if you want to, share your business details in the chat, but don't feel that you, of course, have to. All right, so let's spotlight our guest for the day. And I know that I say that every week I have a special guest, but some of you may know that our guest today happens to also be my husband. So how could I not say that he's a very special guest? So Freddy, thank you for joining us. And I'm delighted to have you here. Let me introduce, for those of you that don't know who Freddy is, Freddy Freundlich, let me introduce and tell you all a little bit about who he is. So Freddy Freundlich is also a speaker, an author, an enabler for technology companies. And today he's going to be sharing his story with us on his father, Eli Freundlich, and Eli's extraordinary life, which started off, he'll share with us in the US and then came to Israel. So Freddy, take it away. Good morning. Thank you so much for sharing your story with all our listeners.
Good morning, Lesley, and thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Today is a very strange day. It is Memorial Day, Yom Hazikaron, 2024, Tashpat 5784 in the Hebrew calendar. And it's strange for a number of reasons. Number one, the first reason would be that, which comes to everybody's mind, is we're in the middle of a war right now. Truth be told, we've been in the middle of a war for the past 76 years. It's just now, it's sort of on steroids. The other thing that makes this day so different, so surreal, and I could be wrong, but I tried to find out if there was any other country in the world who commemorated their soldiers the way Israel does. In other words, for Israel, this is a real Memorial Day. Everybody, young, old, religious, not religious, everybody understands what today is. It's part of who and what we are as Israelis. It's a day that not only that we commemorate our fallen and the people who paid the price for us to live what today is a pretty wonderful life here in Israel, but we go from this day of mourning into this day of celebration, which will be Independence Day tonight. Most countries don't go from one to another. Most countries, as most of you can guess, I come from the United States. The Memorial Day is a totally different time from Independence Day. There's no correlation. The average person in the street, and they do these surveys every year, don't have a clue even what Memorial Day is about, other than being a shopping day and a holiday off and a barbecue day. So here in Israel, we really feel it. Now, what is the history of Yom Hazikaron? First of all, in the first couple of years, there was no Yom Hazikaron. It was Independence Day, and that was it. And then in 1950, 51, there was talk that we needed a separate day. And in 1951 was the first Yom Hazikaron. At that point, the Yom HaZikaron was primarily to remember the veterans of the War of Independence. And it evolved over the years till where I believe in 1963, it also became an official holiday, a commemoration day for victims of terror. And in fact, in 2023, I don't know if it's official, but they decided, or there was talk of making any Jew who died outside of Israel to terror as part of this day. So the day evolves, and I would like to today take another possible evolvement of this day. We mourn and we remember, and we should, all those who gave their lives so we can be here today for the state of Israel, for our very existence. But what about those who gave their lives without actually dying? So that may sound a little bit strange, but there are many people, probably tenfold of the people who actually died, who gave their lives in other ways, people who were injured severely, who will never have a life. They may be brain dead, they may be paralyzed. Even people who, when we hear people who are lightly or moderately injured is very severe. Even lightly injured could mean that this person could never use his or her hand again. So these are people who give their lives without actually dying for us, for the state of Israel, for the Jewish people. This is not to mention all the psychological damage that is done to people. And the truth is, we don't even take into consideration many of the real victims, which is you and I. Because unlike other countries, I personally was in the US Army. Very strange for somebody who comes from my background to volunteer for the US Army. But the truth is, most Americans, Jew or Gentile, have never been in the US Army, don't know anybody in the US Army, and certainly don't know anybody who was hurt, injured, or died in defense of the United States. But almost everyone on this podcast knows somebody, and especially this year, we know somebody, or we know a family of somebody, we know somebody. It affects us all. So in a way, today, more than any other year, Yom HaZikaron is really about us all. I would like to, with that in mind, I'd like to talk about my father, Eli Freundlich, Chaim Eliyahu Freundlich, who was an oddball. I'm a chip off the block. I'm also an oddball. But what I mean by an oddball was he did things out of the box. Let me share a little bit about him. He grew up in Brooklyn, first generation American. His parents were wise enough, or whatever it was, they left before the Shoah. They escaped, but every one of their siblings were murdered by the Germans. So my father grew up not as a child of survivors, but yes, a child of survivors. And he also grew up at a time in America where there was plenty of anti-Semitism. But at the same time, he grew up in a place where he knew he was different, but he also knew he was a proud American. So when America got involved in World War II, my father didn't wait for the draft. He volunteered for the Army. Unfortunately, in his words, he was not sent to Europe. He was sent to the South Pacific. And he received the Medal of Valor there for some of his exploits. He was injured. He also had malaria. So when he came home after World War II, he was not in the best of shape. But he understood what the future for the Jewish people was. And without a country of our own, there was really very little hope. So he decided he wanted to join the the fight. Now, we talk about 1948 as our independence, and we commemorate soldiers who died from the Independence Day War. Well, the Independence Day War did not start in 1948. It started many years before, the early 1900s. In fact, when my father visited Israel several years ago, we took him on Yom HaZikaron to Har Herzl, and it's beautifully set up there. You can go and ask them. There's information booths where you can look up any soldier who died in the war, even before 1948. 1940, 1928, doesn't matter. If there's a record and if they're buried, they will tell you not only that they're there, but where they are. They may be in Haifa, they may not be in Har Herzl. And he was able to track down friends and colleagues of his who he had no idea where they were buried. So when we talk about our heroes and our heroines, it's just not from 1948. It goes way back. And just like this war we're in now, which is also still part of a war of independence, we're fighting the same enemies for the same reasons. Our right to exist in this little patch of land in the middle of nowhere, nothing has changed. I say nothing has changed, but a lot of things have changed. And on the most part, they've all changed for the better. We're a much different country today than we were in 1948. Time does not allow me to go into those details, but let me return to my father. So my father decided he was going to come to Israel. Well, you just didn't get on El Al then and hop to Israel. In fact, the British who ran Palestine at the time had no patience for anybody who wanted to help the Jewish people here. So my father actually wrote a letter several years ago to one of my daughters, in which he gave a little history where it was about what he had come from. And I would like to read some of those excerpts, some part of this letter, and to share with you what's in his own words. Okay, so he start talks about, and here I will paraphrase that because he knew what was going on and what the future would be, he decided he would come to Israel. At the time, this was before 1948, there was no Tzahal, there was no Israeli army. In his words, there were three organizations, the Palmach, Etzel, Lehi. Each group had the same goal, to drive the occupying force out of Palestine. Each, however, had a different philosophy on how to accomplish that. I believe, this is my father saying, in the Lehi approach. The Lehi was the Stern Gang, the what you would call today the extremists. The Palmach believed in cooperation with the British in most ways. Etzel believed in fighting the British army by attacking military objectives. And my father says, I settled for the Etzel because I wasn't brave enough to join Lehi. In retrospect, I don't know if that was true. My father was a very brave man, but he joined Etzel and he fought under Menachem Begin. Now, to come to Israel, as I said, wasn't easy. So to get to Palestine, and again, I'm reading from him, I had to join Beitar. And then I had to join the Aliyah Betche, the Ben Hecht, as a sailor, pick up refugees in France, be intercepted by the English Navy on the Mediterranean Sea, and be interned in a Cyprus concentration camp for 9 months. Now, just a little side note, my father did not have to go through this because he was an American citizen with an American passport. But when the British boarded his ship, he threw his passport overboard. He feigned like he did not speak English. He knew Yiddish. He spoke Yiddish. And he became one of these same lice-infested refugees they had picked up in Cyprus. He went to, because he was determined by hook or by crook, he was going to get to Palestine. They would have sent him back to the States. So he got sent to a concentration camp, what he calls it, an internment camp in Cyprus, where he was there for 9 months till he managed to escape. It's another story how he escaped. But then when he finally made it to Palestine, the British caught him again, and he spent several more months in what he calls Atlit concentration camp. And then finally, he got out of that, and several weeks in Kiryat Meir, a Sachnut orientation camp for newly arrived refugees. This in short was my saga from New York to Haifa. This took from December 1946 to approximately November 1947. So Eli Freundlich spent almost a year, when all his comrades were back in the States going to school and getting on with their life. He spent a year of his life in and out of, whether you call it a concentration camp or detention camps, just to actually get here before he even did anything. And then he finally was able to make contact and join Etzel. Well, Etzel was an underground group, as we know. It wasn't, you just didn't walk up to a recruiting center to join it. So again, I will read what he says. I made the necessary contacts through a woman who I knew from the US. Unbeknownst to me, she too was a member of Etzel. She sent me to another woman who sent me to Beit Jabotinsky. I gave them a brief history of my background, my requests. In a few days, I was contacted by someone about my age with instructions to appear on a certain street on a particular evening on a certain date with a book in my left hand. Following instructions, I appeared on an empty street, not yet completely finished, in a newer section of town. In a short while, another young man appeared. We exchanged passwords. He instructed me to proceed to a particular incompletely built house down the street and wait inside the unfinished building. Stepping over a debris building material holes, I found myself in a dark, unfinished space alone. After what seemed a long while, I was led into another dark space, but with a very, very bright spotlight shining upon my face. I saw no one, only the bright light. The voice asked many questions about my background, why I wanted to join the Etzel, and etc. So this was just to get into the fight. And it sounds very clandestine, very mysterious. But remember, in those days, there were lots of enemies. Unfortunately, some of the enemies were the Jews themselves. They were the British, and they were the Arabs. Moving on, my father did join the Etzel. And it was not like the movies. We had no weapons. We had absolutely no weapons. My father tells a story. He also tells that most of the people had no training, didn't know what they were doing. My father was really in demand because he was a combat veteran, and he was assigned to a unit to defend Ramallah, and they gave him a machine gun. The only problem was this machine gun, which was captured from the British, had the wrong bullets. And it sounds like a comedy, but my father relates what he calls nisim and niflaot, major miracles in how he personally survived the combat, and how we even got to the place where we actually won. And people really need to do some research and understand that we had absolutely nothing. You don't have to believe in God, but you have to believe in some higher power to understand why we're here today. Our time is running out, so I don't have a lot of time, and I would have liked to tell some of his stories that he mentioned here when he says nisim and neflaot. But I would like to talk about one story, and again, I will read his from his own words. He is going through in here some of the battles in Ramleh that he was there, and he continues and he says, the following day, the Arabs invaded our Shetach. Now remember, he was fighting the British and the Arabs at the same time. The British did not want us to have a state, did not want us to have a country, and they were allies of the Arabs. Again, not so much has changed today. The following day, the Arabs invaded our Shetach. When I realized we were overrun, I knew it was time to run. To do so, I would have to run straight out of my bunker over a 4 feet heap of rubble towards the setting sun in the west. In addition, it was necessary to check the side from which the Arabs were pouring in the east. This meant that I had to step out of my bunker, crouch along to the end of the bunker to look around the corner to see how close the Arabs were. As I was doing so, and before I reached the corner, I saw the end of a rifle stick out from the corner. It was pointing upward toward the fourth floor of a taller building, about 20 feet from the bunker. In that moment, I froze in my tracks as I waited for the Arab to stick his head around the corner to see what might be coming along my side. To my Ashkacha Pratus, he fired first at the building, which I knew was empty, and then he looked around the corner. All this was happening in microseconds. As soon as he fired his rifle, I could relax because I knew he had no bullet in his rifle now. He would now be unarmed until he reloaded his rifle. He did not reload his rifle. He did stick his head around the corner, and that explains why my granddaughter is here today to hear a Zaidi story, and he has no granddaughter to hear anything. He then follows with another story where my father talks a lot about Hashkacha Pratus. For those of you who don't know, it's sort of like the will of God where fate steps in. And he was talking about, he was checking on the position of the enemy. It was necessary to know that I could make my break without being shot. I got my answer. The Arabs were pouring in from behind the direction I'd have to run, which meant if anyone saw me and I couldn't see how anyone would miss me, I would be shot in the back. I quickly scooted back to my bunker. In the bunker, I told the other Etzelniks that we would have to make a break for it. Frankly, I don't see how we would make it. The problems were the closest point to safety was a pardes about 100 yards away. A pile of rubble of building material about 4 feet high, and the Arabs pouring in from behind. The scene was that I would have to make a 100-yard dash over a 4-foot pile of rubble, and I'd be making an excellent targets for the Arabs firing at me from behind. While rethinking my plan to escape and getting a bad case of cold feet, the Rabbanu Shalom demonstrated for me that there is such a phenomenon as Hashkachas Pratus. He shot me in order to save my life. This is how it happened. As I was hesitating about making the break, I thought that I would step out the bunker once more to see if the coast was clear. Now I repeat, everything that was happening in microseconds. Just as I was about to take one more look to see if the coast was clear, my buddies ran through the door of the bunker, wounded. At that instant, I was about to step out. With 1 foot and half my body outside the door, 2 Arabs came crouching along the side of the bunker. All of us froze. Both Arabs automatically fired their rifles at me. Both were about 1 rifle length away. Both fired simultaneously and instantly. I saw 2 chips of brick from the edge of the door post shot away, and I immediately felt hit in the chest. Being shot at point blank range, I expected it to find my chest blown away or at least blood gushing out in torrents. I wondered why I only saw a trickle of blood coming out of my chest. I even wondered when the excruciating pain from my broken bones would begin. All this happened in microseconds. I didn't dwell too long on the thought. I now knew I had no choice. I had to take the risk of being shot in the back because if I remained, I would probably bleed to death. So here is the next miracle. Hashem shot me just enough so I'd realize that I had no choice, but not enough to prevent my movements. The 2 Arabs who shot at me ducked into the bunker right next to mine. This meant that I had to waste a few moments to get rid of them so they wouldn't shoot me in the back as I ran by them. I dropped a hand grenade through the window of their bunker, waited a second for the grenade to explode, and immediately made my break. I take credit for an additional nest that occurred this time. The 4 Etzelniks who shared my bunker with me all followed my lead. We all made it safely into the Pardes. Okay. My father further relates that it's a good thing that they weren't attacked at that point because they had actually no ammunition. A lot of great miracles happened in those days as they happen now. Finally, the last story I'd like to tell about my father happened in Jerusalem. He was in the old city. He was coming around corner there. All of a sudden, he runs into the enemy, and the Arab comes out, and he has a hand grenade, and he pulls the pin and he throws it at my father. My father reacts very quickly, and he shoots this Arab. The grenade goes off, but doesn't reach my father, and my father is badly injured. He was so badly injured in those days, they would be afraid to take the grenade. They couldn't operate because the grenade shrapnel was too close to his heart. My father died 5 years ago. He still had that piece of grenade from 1948 in his chest. As I close, I wrote a book called Born on the Right Side of the Tracks. And in this book, I talk about a number of things. And one of the things are my experiences, my rough experiences with my father growing up. And as I reread the book after it was published a couple of times myself, I realized that no brainer, my father suffered from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, both from the World War II and what happened in Israel. This is something we don't commemorate on Yom HaZikaron. Today, we have so many soldiers. Thank God today we are aware of this. In those days, he went back and nobody had a clue. And he suffered all these years, and his family suffered, and those around him. He suffered because of Kiddush Hashem. He gave of himself. He gave so we could all be here today. And I think that on this day, we really need to be aware of the sacrifice that all our soldiers are making, whether they actually get killed on the battlefield or not. Thank you very much for your time. It's all yours, Lesley.
Right. Thank you so much, Freddy, for sharing this incredible story of your father. And as you've said more than once, that on Yom HaZikaron, where we usually, and we do commemorate those that have fallen, as well as victims of terror, but as you said, there are tens of thousands of soldiers over all the years that have had other injuries and not necessarily died. And I think it's so important to actually remember this, as well as the generations in the future that are affected as a result from somebody being in the war or a victim of terror. So thank you again, Freddy, for sharing the story with us. So you've been listening to the Monday Motivations Spotlight podcast. We run every single Monday live unless there's a chag. You're welcome if you want to re-listen to Freddy's story, or if you want to listen to any of the other amazing speakers that we've had, you can go onto YouTube and just write in Monday Motivation Spotlight or Lesley Kaplan channel, subscribe. You can follow that way. You'll be updated when there's new episodes. So next week, before I sign off, we have a very, very different tone. We have our friend and colleague, Sharon Altschul, who is here with us today. She will be our Monday Motivation Spotlight. Sharon, as you know, is a photographer, or many of you know, is a photographer and journalist. And with her press pass, she gets to go to a lot of the official and government events and conferences. So she's going to be sharing behind the scenes with us, which is also a good, lead off from Yom HaZikaron and Yom Haátzmaut, many of the behind the scenes events and things that she's seen. Thank you again for joining us. Am Yisrael Chai. May we have only good health, safety, Am Yisrael, all our soldiers, and of course, see the safe return of our hostages. Thank you for joining us. Have a good day, or a solemn day, or a meaningful day, should we say, on this special day. Bye-bye.